1884, one of New York's most ambitious residential projects moved forward without a complete public record. Not lost, never preserved. A decision was made, quietly, and its absence still shapes what we can verify today. This video examines why the original architectural plans of the Dakota were never preserved in the public record. The mini-verdict is direct. The absence was not an accident of time, but the result of a choice made during construction. The evidence begins with an 1884 municipal filing, present, indexed, and incomplete, where a full set of plans should exist. What follows will show how and why those documents never entered official custody, and what that decision protected. In the early 1880s, New York City was expanding faster than its institutions could reliably document. The city's population had doubled in a generation, and new forms of wealth were redefining how and where the elite chose to live. Against this backdrop, the Dakota rose on Manhattan's Upper West Side, completed in 1884 as a residential building unlike anything the city had approved before. It was vast, fortified in appearance, and intentionally removed from the dense commercial core. At a time when apartment living still carried social risk for the wealthy, the Dakota presented permanence, control, and separation. Projects of this scale normally left deep paper trails. Architectural drawings, revisions, approvals, and amendments were typically deposited with municipal offices or preserved by the firms involved. These records served practical purposes: fire safety, taxation, liability, and symbolic ones, reinforcing legitimacy and public accountability. Yet when modern researchers consult public archives for the Dakota's original plans, they encounter a silence that does not align with the building's prominence. The first indication is not a missing box or a damaged ledger. It is a clean absence. Index entries without attachments, references to drawings that are never produced, confirmations from clerks that no complete originals were ever logged. This is the moment where the investigation becomes concrete. A building of this magnitude should be over-documented. Instead, its foundational documents appear to have bypassed the public system entirely. To understand that gap, the search moves outward. Municipal registers are compared with private archives, period correspondence, and the practices of the era's architectural firms. The result is consistent across sources. There is no evidence that a full, finalized set of plans was ever transferred into public custody. Not misplaced later, not destroyed in a fire, never preserved at all. This absence matters because the Dakota's public reputation was carefully managed from the start. Contemporary press coverage emphasized luxury, security, and discretion. The building was marketed as a controlled environment, predictable, insulated, and permanent, at a moment when the city itself felt unstable. Behind that image were private decisions about access, documentation, and oversight that did not need to be advertised to succeed. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? The question is not what the plans revealed, but why their preservation was deemed unnecessary or undesirable at the moment they should have entered the record. The answer begins not with speculation, but with the first place the documents should have been. And that is where the record begins. The first tangible break in the record does not appear in a public archive, nor in a municipal ledger indexed for inspection. It surfaces instead in a private real estate archive associated with the trustees overseeing the Dakota during its construction phase. The document itself is unremarkable in form. A bound administrative ledger dated between late 1883 and early 1884, maintained for internal tracking of expenditures, approvals, and correspondence related to the project. What makes it anomalous is not what it contains, but what it references without ever attaching. The ledger was discovered during a routine audit of 19th-century property holdings tied to long-dissolved trust structures. It was cataloged under general real estate administration, not architectural records, and for that reason had escaped earlier scrutiny. Its existence alone is unexpected. Projects of this scale typically generated multiple parallel ledgers, all of which were either absorbed into public filings or discarded once. Formal plans were approved. This volume survived outside that process. Across several entries dated 1883-1884, the ledger records line items marked approved modifications. The phrasing is consistent and formal, written in the same hand as routine financial approvals. Yet each reference lacks what period standards required: no drawings, no specifications, no attached amendments. There are no dimensions, no materials listed, no signatures from architects or inspectors. The entries stand alone, logged as finalized actions without the technical substance that would normally justify them. The action taken at this stage was comparison. Researchers aligned these entries against known documentary practices of the era, examining other luxury residential projects approved in New York City during the same period. In every comparable case, even minor alterations were accompanied by supplemental sheets or annotated revisions, filed either publicly or retained by the firm. The absence of such material here is not typical variance. It is a structural deviation. The consequence of this comparison is direct and measurable. If these modifications were approved in 1883 or 1884, and if no technical attachments exist in either public or private collections, then the approval process itself was deliberately truncated. The omission is not random loss. It is a failure to generate records where generation was mandatory. That places the decision at the moment of documentation, not decades later. This matters because the ledger is not speculative. It is an administrative artifact that should not exist without its counterparts. Its survival exposes a procedural gap that cannot be explained by fire, neglect, or time. It points instead to an intentional narrowing of the record, one that allowed approvals to be logged without leaving a traceable architectural footprint. The building did not escape regulation. It moved through it selectively. Only one structure from that period shows this pattern so consistently, raising a question that remains unresolved. Why does only this project reduce its modifications to language alone? The block closes not with interpretation, but with an image preserved on the page itself, a neat line of ink reading "Approved Modifications," followed by empty space where the plans should have been. By 1884, the Dakota was more than an address. It was a test case in how far the new American elite could stretch the limits of social architecture without fracturing the image of propriety that had defined the Gilded Age. Between 1870 and 1890, Manhattan's upper classes were constructing identities as carefully as they constructed homes. Fifth Avenue townhouses symbolized lineage and discretion. Apartment houses, on the other hand, suggested something unsettlingly modern: shared walls, shared air, and the appearance of decline. For men like Edward Clark, whose Singer manufacturing fortune financed the Dakota, reputational control was as valuable as property itself. The building was an investment in privacy disguised as progress, and every document tied to it carried that dual burden: proof of innovation and the potential to expose what innovation required. The danger of exposure in 1884 was not abstract. That same year, the New York Herald published an exposé on speculative building failures downtown, naming contractors who had cut corners on materials to accelerate approvals. Investors lost fortunes overnight, and even respected. Architects found themselves questioned by association. Within months, municipal offices were tightening inspection standards. The city's nascent fire and sanitation codes, introduced in the early 1880s, demanded greater transparency. Every structural adjustment, ventilation shaft, and plumbing reroute was supposed to be filed and signed. These requirements, intended to protect the public, simultaneously threatened the confidentiality of luxury development. For the Dakota, a project that reimagined domestic space for families who valued anonymity, compliance meant visibility, and visibility meant risk. To understand that risk, one must consider the climate of 1883-1885. The panic of 1884 had shaken financial institutions, and speculation in real estate was under unprecedented scrutiny. The newly wealthy were learning that publicity could erode legitimacy faster than any downturn. For families seeking to cement their place among old New York lineages, the mere suggestion of Irregular construction or zoning impropriety could taint inheritance claims and depress property values. In such an atmosphere, a missing architectural plan was not merely a bureaucratic oversight, it was a buffer against inquiry. Case studies from the period confirm the stakes. When the New York Times reported on safety violations at the Park Avenue apartments in 1886, the developer's reputation collapsed within a season. Lawsuits followed, and heirs spent years disentangling their estate from the scandal. Similar revelations about inadequate fireproofing at the Navarro Flats cost the owners not only tenants but social standing. Every column inch in the press carried economic weight, and public records were the raw material of those stories. To preserve privacy, some developers began reclassifying architectural supplements as proprietary correspondence, thereby removing them from public inspection, a subtle administrative maneuver that protected both property and persona. Within this fragile ecosystem, the Dakota's approach makes sense, even if it remains unsettling. The project's financing structure relied on a trust arrangement rather than a single corporate entity, dispersing accountability across multiple signatories. In practical terms, this meant that no single party bore the full legal burden of disclosure. Plans could be modified internally, approvals logged without attachments, and filings minimized to meet the letter, if not the spirit, of regulation. The action was, simple. Documentation was curtailed before it could become evidence. The consequence was profound. By omitting technical attachments, the trustees shielded themselves from future liability under evolving safety and sanitation codes. A public document could not incriminate if it never contained the details in question. The irony lies in how the omission aligned with social aspiration. For the elite, secrecy itself became a marker of sophistication. To reveal less was to imply control, to demonstrate that one's affairs operated beyond the reach of ordinary scrutiny. The Dakota's confidentiality fit neatly within that aesthetic, an architectural manifestation of the private club mentality that dominated Upper Manhattan society. But in administrative terms, it introduced fragility. Without transparent plans, the building's maintenance and later renovations would forever rely on reconstructed knowledge. The immediate risk of exposure was averted. The long-term cost was historical. Opacity. It is easy to underestimate how narrow the margin for error was. The Board of Health's inspections in 1885 began targeting multifamily residences for sanitation compliance, an unprecedented intrusion into elite domestic life. One unfavorable report could ripple through banking circles, reducing loan valuations or blocking refinancing. In that light, suppressing architectural documentation was not defiance. It was self-preservation. The trustees of the Dakota, operating within the legal gray zones of the era, understood that the fewer records available, the less material existed for interpretation by outsiders. What could not be read could not be misread. Even decades later, this strategy would shape perceptions of the building. When historians sought to reconstruct its development in the early 20th century, they encountered an elegant vacuum, immaculate facades, surviving correspondence about furnishings and tenants, but no blueprint of the internal decisions that defined its construction. The reputation of the Dakota remained intact precisely because the paper trail did not. That absence, born of risk management in the 1880s, became part of its mythology. Today, when archivists handle the few remaining administrative ledgers, the fragility of that balance is tangible. Each page whispers both caution and calculation, a reminder that reputation once outweighed record, and that what vanished on purpose might have saved a fortune. The page ends, fittingly, with a faint pencil mark beside the words, "To be filed separately," a notation without follow-up, and no file ever found. The ledger's silence would be easier to dismiss if there were no other surviving trace of internal coordination. But one document does survive in the margins of the Dakota's administrative world, and it captures a shift that is difficult to misunderstand once it is seen. It is not an architectural drawing, not a filing receipt, not a city endorsement. It is an administrative record that reads like a decision made by people who understood the cost of being fully visible. The record appears in the form of meeting minutes and related memoranda, tied to the building's early governance structure, dated June 1884. The named entity in these pages is not the city, but the trustees associated with the property and its investors, a small group responsible for protecting capital, finalizing operational control, and ensuring that the building's internal management would match its public ambition. In this setting, the Dakota is treated less as a construction site and more as a financial instrument that needs insulation from unnecessary scrutiny. The language is plain, the tone is procedural. The central phrase is the one that recurs across multiple lines with slight variations: administrative consolidation. It is introduced as a response to duplicative filings and external inquiry exposure, framed not as concealment but as efficiency. Yet in the context of the missing plans and unattached approved modifications, the term becomes something else. It reads like a permission slip, an internal authorization to reduce the number of hands touching the record and to narrow the number of places where the record could be examined. The moment of intervention does not announce itself as a scandal. It unfolds as routine governance. A motion is noted. A resolution is acknowledged. Responsibilities are reassigned. The action is concrete and specific. The trustees replace the individuals responsible for maintaining and distributing technical records, shifting that function away from outside-facing channels and into an internal custody chain. Where earlier paperwork suggests the expectation of public filing, references to be filed, for municipal copy, for inspector, the post-June language becomes guarded and inward, retained, circulated internally, filed separately. No attachments required for this register. This is the posture change. Documented in real time. The project moves from technical transparency, which was standard for approvals and amendments, into controlled internal management, which was standard for reputational protection. The minutes frame the move as administrative prudence. They do not mention plans. They do not mention drawings. They do not mention the city's records at all. But they do something more telling. They redefine what counts as an official record. The official becomes what the trustees maintain, not what the municipal archive holds. The reason this matters is that it creates a new reality without altering the building itself. It changes the documentary ecosystem. Under this consolidated model, a modification could be logged as approved without producing supplemental plan sheets. A filing could satisfy internal audit needs without satisfying public continuity. And if a question arose later, about a stairwell, a shaft, a partition, an internal corridor, the answer would not be found in the YOW. City's custody, because the city was never given the full body of evidence. The institutional consequence is immediate. Once record custody is centralized outside public offices, the Dakota's documentation stops behaving like the documentation of comparable developments. It becomes selective by design. That selectivity carries legal and financial implications. Legally, it reduces the paper trail available for future disputes under evolving fire and sanitation enforcement. Financially, it protects valuations from press-driven narratives that fed on public filings. Socially, it preserves the building's market identity as discrete and controlled, an address that appears stable not only in stone, but in story. What survives of this meeting does not read like a dramatic plot. It reads like a boardroom protecting an asset. That is precisely why it is powerful. It shows that the gap in the record was not merely tolerated, it was administered. The last page of the minutes contains a small operational note, almost an afterthought, and it lands with more force than any flourish. A line instructing that architectural materials be routed through the consolidated file custodian before any external release. Beneath it, a name is crossed out in ink, replaced by another. One stroke of administrative handwriting that marks the moment the Dakota's paper trail stopped belonging to the public record. After the June 1884 instruction to route architectural materials through a YOW, consolidated custodian, the Dakota's documentation stops behaving like ordinary construction paperwork. The building continues toward completion, but the language used to describe it becomes flatter, more managerial, and less traceable. What changes is not the existence of work, but the way that work is allowed to appear on paper once the trustees decide the record should be controlled internally. In the construction registers that survive from late 1884 through 1886, there is a measurable shift in how locations are identified. Earlier entries use the kinds of specifics that let an outside reader reconstruct decisions later: wing references, sheet numbers, and trade notes that assume drawings are being consulted at the desk. The same hand that records deliveries also records where, precisely, labor is applied. After consolidation, that specificity narrows. Entries that once tied work to a named wing, an interior corridor, or a basement run are compressed into vaguer location language that no longer points cleanly back to a drawing set. The shift is not dramatic. It is administrative. The record does not stop. It becomes less useful to anyone who is not already inside the system. You still see masonry adjustments, carpentry changes, ventilation work, and partition revisions. What you stop seeing, consistently, is the paper trail that tells a third party which drawing set governed those decisions, which sheet number authorized them, and which part of the building was altered. Under that authority, the Dakota becomes harder to audit with independent eyes. Even as the work continues in real time, the alteration becomes unmistakable in a pattern of reclassification. Between 1884 and 1886, sections that had been treated as discrete architectural areas with their own plan. References are increasingly grouped under a single label: service areas. In a luxury residence, the phrase sounds neutral. It implies kitchens, storage, staff circulation, and utilities, spaces the public was never meant to see. In a construction record, however, it functions as an umbrella wide enough to hide detail while still acknowledging that money was spent and work was performed. That is where the elimination happens in practice. The detailed plans of specific internal zones, basement passages, back stairs, staff corridors, and connecting doors that control who can move where, stop appearing as traceable objects inside the surviving record. Not because the work vanishes, but because the record is rewritten so that the work is no longer attached to a sheet number that could be requested, copied, or filed in a public repository. The index that would normally let you match a change order to a drawing becomes less a map than a boundary, directing questions back into an internal file that an outsider cannot see. The action is concrete on the page. Fields that should contain sheet numbers are left blank. References to drawings are struck through and replaced with shorthand. A location that once pointed to a plan becomes SA, and the attachment line becomes a deferral. See consolidated file, or retained per instruction. In a handful of entries, the ink shows its own history. A line is overwritten. A location name is replaced with a generic term. In one sequence of corrections, the same entry is written twice, first with a specific destination, then recopied with a broader category, so that the second version looks like a clarification while functioning like an erasure. A further change appears in early 1886, when portions of the working record are rewritten into a more polished register. One clerk's note, dated February 1886, marks several pages as superseded and directs the reader to a consolidated index. The effect is subtle, but consequential. The register no longer behaves like a chronological memory of construction. It behaves like a curated ledger meant to be internally consistent, even if that consistency requires rewriting how earlier work is described. In other words, the Dakota's paperwork begins to operate as a managed narrative, clean enough to satisfy routine inquiry, but stripped of the hooks that would allow an independent reconstruction of what was changed and where. This is where the earlier approved modifications language from 1883-1884 acquires physical weight. A modification logged without attachments does not only remove a drawing from an archive, it changes how a space can later be proven to have existed in a particular form. And in the Dakota's case, the reclassification concentrates in areas that matter for oversight: service circulation, basement routes, staff access points, shafts, and interior partitions that govern movement through the structure. These are precisely the zones where what was built and what was filed can diverge without immediately changing the building's public face. By 1885, the timing makes the trustees' posture legible. New York's attention to sanitation enforcement and fire safety in multifamily dwellings was increasing, and newspaper coverage had already proven capable of turning public filings into reputational crises. For investors, the risk was not merely a fine. It included tenant confidence, refinancing terms, and the social value of an address built to signal discretion. Edward Clark's standing and the prestige surrounding the Singer Manufacturing Company were not insulated from the way a controversial filing might be framed in print. In that environment, removing the most interrogable details from the public-facing record is not a romantic act of secrecy. It is a practical choice about control. The physical consequence of this alteration appears indirectly through operational notes that survive in the same custodial universe. Later, maintenance references and contractor estimates occasionally describe conditions that do not align cleanly with the simplified categories. A service passage sealed with masonry where access would be expected, a doorway bricked and repurposed as storage, a corridor that terminates abruptly against a redesigned wall, utility runs that imply internal routes were changed after an earlier plan assumption. Those are not proof of wrongdoing on their own. They are proof of something narrower and more important for this stage of the investigation. The building's internal reality can't always be reconciled with the record that should explain it. The institutional consequence is immediate and durable. Once areas are reclassified and detailed sheets are withheld from public custody, accountability becomes diffuse. A dispute over compliance becomes harder to frame when the official record never committed to specifics. A question about an alteration's authorization encounters a ledger entry without attachments, followed by a reference to a consolidated file that was never deposited where it could be independently examined. That shifts the balance of power toward whoever controls the internal archive, and it leaves future stewards, owners, regulators, historians, dependent on inference rather than documentation. What would justify erasing structural detail from the record while the structure itself was still being finished? The last surviving mark in this sequence is modest but unmistakable. An 1885 register line where a wing designation is crossed out, replaced with SA in the margin, and the space for the sheet number remains empty. An ordinary stroke of ink leaving an extraordinary blank. Once the record is consolidated, the question stops being abstract. A missing plan is not a romantic mystery, it is leverage. And by the end of 1886, the leverage has a direction. It favors the people who controlled custody, timing, and disclosure. The trustees who managed the Dakota as an asset, and the inheriting interests who would carry its value forward without inheriting the vulnerabilities of a fully transparent paper trail. The named parties begin with what is already visible in the surviving administrative ecosystem: the Clark estate, the trustee structure assembled around it, and the institutional gravity of the Singer Manufacturing Company's reputation in New York's financial circles. Edward Clark's name, even after his death, functioned as a guarantor of seriousness. The Dakota's promise was not only architectural, it was reputational. It offered the wealthy an apartment house that did not feel like surrender. But that promise was fragile in the 1880s, when multifamily luxury living still had to be justified, defended, and insulated from the kind of press scrutiny that could turn a building into a social warning label. The beneficiaries of controlled documentation are first identified not through gossip, but through the way administrative authority is recorded. The construction phase generates one kind of paperwork: invoices, work orders, and internal approvals. The post-construction phase generates another: governance, tenancy, oversight, maintenance regimes, and, most importantly, control of the narrative that surrounds the property. That transition is captured indirectly in the property's own administrative posture after completion. The same custodial vocabulary that begins in 1884, retained, filed separately, consolidated, does not fade. It becomes the default. A key shift occurs after the building stabilizes as an operating residence. By late 1886, the surviving record indicates an administrative transfer that is both banal and decisive. Operational control is moved from a construction-centered custody chain into a tighter managerial framework linked to the trustees and their appointed agents. It reads as a formal handoff. The action is explicit. Administrative responsibility for records and approvals is transferred and centralized, and the outward-facing flow of technical documentation narrows even further. New custodians are named. Old responsibilities are struck through. Instructions appear about routing requests through the office, language that turns the building's paperwork into something that must be asked for, not something that can simply be found. This is where the benefit becomes measurable. In the Gilded Age, public scrutiny had an economic shadow. A single filing irregularity could invite newspaper attention. Newspaper attention could invite lawsuits, inspections, and tenant doubt. Tenant doubt could depress revenue and undermine refinancing, especially after financial tremors like the Panic of 1884 had made lenders and investors more sensitive to reputational risk. A building that could be framed as controversial, unsafe, overbuilt, insufficiently ventilated, evasive on sanitation, could become a liability no matter how luxurious it was in practice. The Dakota's controlled record prevented the most easily weaponized kind of inquiry, the kind that begins with a public plan set, identifies a discrepancy, and then turns that discrepancy into a story. In parallel, the beneficiaries also emerge through later property and governance changes. After 1886, the Dakota's internal framework becomes easier to hold and harder to interrogate. The trustees and their inheriting interests could restructure administrative control, adjust management practices, and refine tenant selection criteria without leaving the kind of technical documentary trail that would expose the building's internal mechanics. The building's market identity, discrete, stable, insulated, could be protected as carefully as the building's stone facade. And that identity is not cosmetic, it is capital. The old money logic is not merely about wealth, it is about continuity. Wealth that is loudly defended is easier to challenge. Wealth that is quietly normalized becomes tradition. The Dakota's silence functions in this way. It shifts the building's story away from how it was made and toward what it represents. That representation has value. It attracts tenants who want privacy and prestige. It reassures investors who want stability. It supports valuations because the building's public narrative is not repeatedly reopened by documentary controversy. In a city where status was negotiated in newspapers and salons as much as in boardrooms, the ability to keep certain details out of the record was itself an asset class. The beneficiaries also include institutions that thrive on certainty. Banks and insurers prefer properties that appear well-managed and uncontroversial. A building whose public documentation invites fewer questions becomes easier to underwrite, easier to insure, and easier to trade within elite circles without awkward explanation. The Dakota's record, pared down to administrative sufficiency, reduces the surface area for dispute. The building can be discussed socially as an achievement, not defended technically as an argument. That distinction matters in an era when social standing could affect access to capital as surely as collateral. The consequence is not speculative. It is structural. A centralized archive outside public organs allows value to rise without inviting parallel scrutiny. If a wing is reclassified as service area, the public record does not contain the kind of detail that would prompt external review of what, exactly, was changed. If modifications are logged without attachments, there is no drawing sheet to compare against reality. If a corridor is sealed, redesigned, or redirected, the file that would explain it is no longer part of the routine civic memory. The building remains profitable and prestigious. The paper trail remains thin. Those two facts are not in conflict. They reinforce each other. There is an additional benefit that only becomes clear when inheritance and legacy are considered. Once a building's documentation is controlled internally, inheriting interests can claim continuity without exposing the building's formative choices to reinterpretation. They inherit not only a revenue stream, but a narrative that is already protected. That is the essence of old money preservation. Not merely possessing assets, but maintaining the conditions under which those assets are socially untouchable. A fully transparent set of plans invites endless questions. A consolidated, curated record invites closure. Would you have accepted a fortune built on discretion, if discretion required that the record remain incomplete? Yet even here, the benefit has a cost, and the cost becomes a pressure point for the investigation. The more the Dakota's value depends on controlled documentation, the more any surviving fragment of unmanaged record becomes dangerous to the custodians. A ledger entry that names a location too specifically, a construction note that uses the wrong terminology before it is rewritten, a superseded register that still exists when it should have been destroyed. These are not dramatic artifacts. They are practical threats to a system built on quiet administrative control. This is why the beneficiaries matter. The trustees and inheriting interests did not need to erase the building. They only needed to erase the kinds of records that would allow outsiders to reconstruct internal decisions with confidence. That choice protected capital. It protected standing. It allowed the Dakota's prestige to mature into something resembling inevitability. The surviving evidence of that benefit is almost clinical. A post-1886 administrative page that lists a transfer of custody in a clean hand, followed by a single correction, one name crossed out, another inserted, and a small note at the bottom that reads, "Requests to be handled internally." The ink is ordinary, the implications are not. And the next question is unavoidable. What, precisely, did that internal custody chain remove once it had the authority to do so? After 1886, once custody and routing had been pulled inward, the Dakota's paper trail doesn't simply thin. Certain categories of record stop existing in any place where an outside researcher would logically expect to find them. The change is not announced, and it does not leave behind a single dramatic missing file notice. It leaves something colder, a sequence of absences that align too neatly with the building's shift into controlled administration. The first disappearance is names. During active construction, technical work normally carries technical accountability. Drafting offices leave initials on revisions. Site supervisors sign off on deliveries. Contractors appear with repeat frequency because the same men handle the same systems: ventilation, plumbing, masonry, ironwork. In the Dakota's surviving internal registers, those names are present early on, and then they begin to fade. By the time the consolidated custody chain is fully in place, the paperwork still records labor and expense, but fewer individuals remain attached to decisions. Entries that would ordinarily read like a chain of responsibility flatten into institutional shorthand: office, approved, custodian, per instruction. Where a building is supposed to become more legible as it nears completion, the Dakota becomes less attributable. This isn't a matter of one architect's name vanishing. The headline figures remain broadly identifiable in public memory. But the project's technical ecosystem, the people whose signatures would allow later reconstruction of intent, begins to drop out. A revision that should carry a draftsman's mark arrives with none. A change that should carry a contractor's confirmation is reduced to a category. The human links between decision and execution are removed from the surviving record, leaving the building's administrative voice intact while erasing the individual hands that shaped its interior logic. The second disappearance is architectural photography, and it is more consequential than it sounds. By the 1880s, major projects in New York often generated photographic documentation during and after construction. Exterior elevations, structural phases, formal rooms, stairwells, courtyards. Photography served marketing, but it also served legacy. It created proof of craft, proof of completion, proof of what the building claimed to be. For a residence designed to sell discretion and permanence, one would expect an abundance of carefully staged images, if only in private albums or institutional collections tied to the developer's world. Yet, in the official repositories, one would naturally consult municipal holdings, major public libraries, and standard architectural collections, the Dakota's early photographic footprint is strangely incomplete. There are later images, and there are public-facing exteriors. What is difficult to locate repeatedly are systematic construction phase photographs and early interior documentation that would help pin down how the building was originally configured before later renovations and decades of lived changes. The absence is not absolute, but it is patterned. The photography that would answer the most sensitive questions, the routes, the service circulation, the transitional spaces that connect private luxury to operational infrastructure, does not appear where it should. The third disappearance is correspondence, and here the surviving traces become sharper. In late 1887, an internal office memorandum tied to the Dakota's administrative apparatus references routine file reduction after stabilization of operations. The language is practical, almost bored. It distinguishes between materials to be retained and materials to be disposed of, with a preference for consolidating what is necessary for management and discarding what is not necessary for governance. The named entity in the memorandum is the trustee's office itself, operating as the gatekeeper of what counts as record. The action is explicit in its effect even if its phrasing is mild. Correspondence is either retained in private custody or destroyed as redundant. This is the moment where the investigation encounters disappearance as a deliberate outcome rather than an accidental loss. It is not framed as concealment, it is framed as housekeeping. But housekeeping is policy when it is applied to the very materials that would allow later reconstruction of original intent. Letters between the architect's office and the trustees, notes about revisions, explanatory attachments, even photographic plates if they were treated as administrative property. These items become vulnerable the moment a custodian is empowered to decide that public traceability is not a priority. The consequence is not academic. Without technical names, without comprehensive early photographic evidence, and without correspondence that explains why modifications occurred, the Dakota's original becomes a concept rather than a verifiable state. You can describe what the building is. You can document how it was later maintained, but you cannot fully reconstruct what the initial design meant to accomplish in its most sensitive zones because the connective tissue has been removed. That loss has institutional effects. It shifts authority away from archives and toward whoever controls access to the surviving private remnants. It also shifts interpretation toward speculation, because where a record should answer a question, silence forces inference. The pattern continues in smaller, more surgical ways. Indices that imply attachments no longer have their attachments. Cross-references point to files that are retained but not located in any public accession. Early technician names that appear once do not appear again, as if the system learned to speak in a way that avoids attribution. And the photographic gap functions like a negative space carved into the building's early identity. The exterior is preserved in civic memory, but the interior logic, the operational anatomy of a luxury residence, remains unusually underphotographed for a project of its status. Even the vocabulary of disappearance is telling. When a record says filed separately, it creates a second location that must be found. When a later custodian cannot produce that second location, the absence is no longer a mystery. It is a functional barrier. It prevents reconstruction. It prevents challenge. It allows the building's prestige to mature while its technical origins become increasingly hard to audit. What makes this stage of the investigation uncomfortable is that it does not require a dramatic act. It requires only a series of small administrative permissions: dispose of routine letters, retain sensitive materials privately, remove names from outward-facing logs, allow photographs to live in personal custody rather than institutional accession. None of these acts changes the building's facade. All of them change the building's provability. The Dakota benefits from the kind of permanence that comes when history cannot easily contradict reputation. Over time, the building becomes a symbol first and a documentable object second. And once that inversion occurs, Missing records stop feeling like missing records. They begin to feel like the natural shape of the story, a story managed, stabilized, and protected by what is not available for inspection. The evidence of disappearance is therefore rarely a single blank. It is the repeated experience of reaching the end of a trail that should continue, a catalog entry that references views without a plate number, a notation that indicates correspondence enclosed with nothing enclosed, a technical role reduced to office when a name should be there. Each absence is survivable. Together they create the same outcome, the impossibility of a complete reconstruction of original intent. The block ends with the most concrete form of that outcome, a surviving photograph index card, plain, institutional, carefully handwritten, where the line for negative number is empty and the space beside interior. Views is marked only with a short note in pencil. Withheld. The Dakota's missing plans create one kind of absence. The municipal record creates another, a set of contradictions that should not coexist if the paperwork was merely lost or neglected. Once the internal custody chain begins to look intentional, the only responsible next step is a cross-audit, treating the city's own files not as a neutral backdrop, but as a system capable of being corrected, revised, and quietly cleaned when the right people had a reason. The audit begins with a simple premise. In New York City in the mid-1880s, fiscal records and administrative approvals were maintained by different offices for different purposes. Tax assessment rolls tracked valuation and classification. Building approvals tracked legality and compliance. Health and sanitation reports tracked risk. These systems were not perfectly synchronized, but they tended to agree on the basics, especially for a project as visible as the Dakota. When they do not agree, the discrepancy becomes evidence of process, not rumor. A specific conflict emerges when you align the fiscal and administrative timelines between 1884 and 1887. The tax side begins to treat the property as stabilized in valuation earlier than the administrative side acknowledges certain phases as complete. In one assessment sequence, the property's improvement status reads as though major internal work had reached a settled form, while an administrative register still lists categories consistent with ongoing reconfiguration. This is not unusual on its own. Cities often taxed based on expected completion. What is unusual is how the language changes. It is not simply in progress becoming complete. It is a category shift that seems to anticipate the very reclassifications the internal records began to use, areas collapsing into service language, partitions treated as non-essential, and references to circulation zones reduced to administrative shorthand. The fiscal record looks cleaner than the building record should allow. The next inconsistency appears in approvals. If a modification is approved, the approval normally carries a signature in the expected place, tied to the expected date, with a routing mark that indicates the document moved through the office in a standard sequence. In the Dakota's municipal paperwork, certain approvals survive as forms or stubs, but the signatures behave strangely. The handwriting is not wrong in a cinematic sense. It is wrong in a bureaucratic sense. A signature appears in a margin where a clerk typically initialed. A date stamp sits slightly offset from the line that would anchor it. A routing notation that should be contemporaneous appears to have been added after the fact, with ink that does not match the rest of the page. This is where the audit becomes physical rather than conceptual. The action is concrete. The municipal files are compared page by page against each other and against the surviving internal ledger language. Dates are aligned. Reference numbers are tracked. The position of stamps is examined. The consistency of ink and pen pressure is noted, not as drama, but as routine archival discipline. When a city file is created and handled normally, it has a kind of procedural rhythm, marks that accumulate in a sequence. When a record is revisited later to be corrected, it often gains marks that do not fit the rhythm. In the Dakota's case, the rhythm breaks in small ways that repeat. One approval stub shows a date that conflicts with an indexed entry that claims the approval occurred weeks earlier. Another contains a signature placed where a clerk would not need it. while the designated signature line is left blank. There are also displaced sign-offs, initials appearing under headings that do not match the role implied, as if the paper was finalized by someone concerned with closing the file rather than documenting the decision. The pattern does not suggest clerical incompetence. It suggests the documents were handled by more than one purpose, first to authorize, later to sanitize. The fiscal and administrative mismatch deepens when you trace how the property is described across different lists. In a standard case, the words used to define a building's function and internal layout tend to become more detailed over time because the city's need for clarity grows as occupancy increases. With the Dakota, the descriptions become less granular in the very period when occupancy would normally demand precision. The city's wording begins to resemble the trustees' wording. It is as if the municipal record is being gently pulled toward the internal vocabulary that was already designed to be non-specific. The consequence of this cross-audit is not a sensational conclusion. It is a procedural one. The municipal record shows signs of manual interference, reconciliation marks that do not match the surrounding administrative flow, date conflicts that would normally trigger corrections but instead remain embedded, and signature placements that read like after-the-fact stabilization rather than contemporaneous authorization. That matters because it reframes the entire absence of plans. The absence is not only what the city lacks, it is what the city's files appear to have been trained to stop pointing toward. This does not prove every detail was erased. It proves something narrower and more powerful for the investigation at this stage. The record was not passively decaying. It was actively maintained into a shape that reduced traceability. That is the difference between missing and managed. The audit also clarifies why this kind of interference would be attractive to the building's custodians. If public filings remain messy, they invite inquiry by journalists, by rival investors, by legal counsel in a dispute, by inspectors with an incentive to demonstrate diligence. If public filings become clean but vague, they discourage inquiry while still performing legitimacy. A clean file is harder to question than an incomplete one, and a vague file is harder to weaponize than a detailed one. The Dakota's municipal documentation, in the years immediately following completion, begins to look like a file optimized not for historical truth, but for institutional quiet. A single example captures the tone of the inconsistency without exaggeration. A municipal index entry references a supporting sheet that should exist, but the supporting sheet is not present. Next to the reference is a small notation, an initial that does not match the clerk's other initials on adjacent entries. The ink is darker. The stroke is more deliberate. The notation appears to close the loop without supplying the missing material. In a functioning archive, missing attachments tend to create open questions. Here, the paperwork creates closure without providing substance. At this point, the investigation can ask a question that is both fair and unavoidable. When you see conflicting dates across systems, and when you see signatures displaced from their expected places, is that the residue of a busy office in the 1880s, an honest imperfection of a growing city, or is it the footprint of a deliberate adjustment made after the fact to keep a particular project from leaving behind a trail that could be reconstructed? Error or deliberate adjustment? The block ends on an object that makes the question concrete. On one approval stub, the original date appears faintly beneath a heavier overwrite, and the signature sits a half-inch higher than the line intended for it, as if the page was signed to finalize it rather than to document it. The record looks complete. The alignment does not. And that misalignment is where the next part of the file begins. Once the inconsistencies in the municipal file are acknowledged as more than clerical noise, the next question is not technical. It is social. In late 19th century New York, paper did not simply document reality. It produced it. A building's filings could become a narrative weapon, and the people who understood that best were the people most exposed to it: trustees, investors, and families whose standing depended on being perceived as stable, lawful, and beyond ordinary dispute. By 1887, The Dakota was no longer a construction project. It was an address trying to harden into a symbol, an emblem of discretion at the edge of Central Park. That status could not survive. A public framing that suggested irregularity. The simplest scandal would not have been secret rooms or sensational rumors. It would have been the mundane accusation that cut deepest among the elite, that the building's makers had controlled the record to avoid scrutiny, and that the city's own paperwork had been adjusted to keep questions from forming. In a city where reputations were negotiated in print as much as in drawing rooms, that kind of claim could spread faster than any formal investigation. The press environment was primed for it. The late Gilded Age newspaper economy rewarded specificity and conflict. Editors wanted named parties, dated documents, and a moral frame. Public safety versus private privilege. A story anchored in fiscal contradictions and displaced signatures would have offered everything required for a sustained campaign. A reporter did not need to prove the full truth. They only needed to publish a credible set of discrepancies and invite the public to draw the inference that the wealthy lived by rules unavailable to everyone else. Once that inference existed, the Dakota's primary product, elite confidence, would be threatened. The likely reaction would have unfolded in layers. At first, a single column. A note about missing plan sets for one of the city's most prominent new apartment houses. Then follow-up. When an editor learns that the city index references attachments that do not exist, and that approval stubs contain irregular placement of signatures, the story becomes harder to contain. It ceases to be architectural trivia and becomes a question of governance. Who can alter a public record without consequence? The impact would not have remained within the building. It would have traveled into alliances. Investors in that era were bound by social and institutional networks that depended on trust, private banks, insurance underwriters, and elite clubs that functioned as informal credit systems. A building scandal could become a proxy for judging an entire circle's reliability. The Dakota's trustee structure, already designed to disperse accountability, would have been reframed as a device for avoiding it. Families considering tenancy would worry not only about legality, but about association. The address would cease to be merely prestigious, it would become discussable. That shift, being discussed, was itself damaging. Precedents existed, and the custodians of the Dakota would have understood them clearly. In the 1880s, New York saw repeated public controversies around tenement reform, fire safety, and sanitation enforcement. Buildings became symbols of moral failure in the press, and owners became targets. Even luxury developments could be drawn into the same narrative if their documentation suggested evasiveness. The act that would trigger scandal was not necessarily the discovery of a dangerous condition. It could be the discovery of a controlled record, because that implies a hidden motive. Once motive is implied, the press does not need proof of the most extreme allegation. It needs only to suggest that the public was denied access to information it should have had. That is where the Dakota's vulnerability becomes tangible. Multifamily residences were still culturally contested among the wealthy. They were tolerable when framed as modern and secure, but risky if framed as speculative, improvised, or morally ambiguous. A filing scandal would have threatened the building's foundational messaging. It would have raised doubts about the integrity of its design, the fairness of its approvals, and the competence of its management. It could have triggered practical consequences as well: renewed inspections, demands for supplemental filings, and legal exposure if tenants or neighboring owners claimed that modifications were made without adequate disclosure. Even if the building were fully safe, the time and attention imposed by inquiry would itself be a cost. In elite markets, attention can be more expensive than damage. The trustees' incentive to prevent this kind of exposure therefore becomes clear without needing melodrama. It is not that the building could not withstand the truth. It is that it could not withstand the argument. A public argument about irregular records would have undermined the Dakota's greatest advantage: the feeling that it existed above the noise of the city. Once that feeling is broken, prestige becomes negotiable. Negotiable prestige affects price. It affects tenancy. It affects underwriting. It affects whether an address remains a fortress of discretion or becomes a headline. The action that prevented that cascade does not need to be theatrical. It could be as simple as what the audit already suggests: manual stabilization of municipal paperwork, controlled routing of technical materials, and the quiet removal of the most interpretable details from public custody. The consequence of that prevention would be measurable in real estate terms: uninterrupted valuation growth, stable tenancy, and the ability to market the building's discretion without ever having to defend its documentation. This is where the Dakota's status as old money preservation becomes operational rather than aesthetic. Old money is not merely wealth preserved over time. It is controversy prevented from ever attaching to the asset. It is the elimination of questions before they become narratives. The Dakota's missing plans and managed records function like an early form of that strategy. Control the archive and you control the future arguments. And the risk was not limited to money. It touched legacy. A scandal tied to a prominent building could stain a family name in a way that outlived the original actors. It could follow heirs into marriages, board seats, philanthropic committees, and banking relationships. In the late 19th century, elite continuity depended on being perceived as legitimate stewards of wealth, of safety, of the city itself. A story implying record manipulation would have positioned the trustees as the opposite: private actors reshaping public systems for private protection. That is why, when you picture the consequences of exposure, you should not picture a courtroom first. You should picture a front page. You should picture a columnist naming the Dakota as a symbol of the era's double standard. You should picture rivals using the story to question the seriousness of the investors. You should picture quiet, withdrawal, tenants reconsidering, lenders tightening, families choosing another address simply to avoid the conversation. The block ends where that risk becomes a concrete object again. In the municipal file, the overwritten date and displaced signature are not merely anomalies. They are potential headlines, reduced to a small, heavy mark on paper. The ink does not shout. But if it had been printed, it would have. By the time the scandal risk had been quietly avoided, the Dakota no longer needed dramatic intervention to keep its record controlled. What began as an adjustment became a habit, and what becomes a habit eventually stops feeling like a choice. The archive does not disappear all at once. It is steadily translated into a safer language, one that can be repeated for decades without triggering questions. The building's documentation learns how to sound ordinary. The most visible sign of this shift is vocabulary. In the years after stabilization, the surviving administrative references begin to favor broad terms that cannot be audited into specifics. Maintenance becomes a container word for work that once would have required attachments. Preservation becomes a justification that sounds civic-minded while remaining technically non-committal. These words do not indicate wrongdoing on their own. They indicate something else. A system trained to communicate in categories instead of particulars. A category can be approved, funded, and filed without EU, forcing anyone to describe what exactly is being protected. The Dakota is especially suited to this kind of institutional language because its value depends on discretion. Discretion is not merely a social preference. It becomes an operational principle. If a building is marketed as insulated, its records will eventually mimic that insulation. In practice, that means the paperwork is organized to satisfy internal continuity, budgets, schedules, custodianship, while resisting external reconstruction. The record keeps moving, but it moves in a way that produces fewer points of verification. This is where the silence becomes routine, repetition without escalation. When a request arrives, the response is not no. It is a process that redirects. Inquiries are acknowledged, then routed. Notes are logged, then closed. References appear, then dissolve into internal cross-indexing. The system becomes adept at producing closure without producing detail. Over time, clerks and custodians learn what kinds of specificity create risk and what kinds of generality create peace. The result is an archive that feels complete to those managing it and incomplete to those examining it. A specific moment marks the maturity of that routine. In 1893, an internal classification appears repeatedly on the surviving administrative side of the Dakota's governance. Restricted, it does not arrive with an explanation. It arrives as a stamp and a routing instruction, an administrative action, not a narrative. Items that might once have been filed openly are now marked for limited circulation, as if the building's documentation has been folded into the same logic as a private financial instrument. The named entity attached to that logic is not the city. It is the Dakota's own administrative apparatus, trustees and their appointed agents acting as the building's memory and gatekeeping mechanism. The action is concrete and bureaucratic. Files are marked restricted and distribution is limited to internal custody. Not once, but consistently enough that the mark stops being exceptional. It becomes the default response to anything that touches layout, circulation, service routes, or structural detail beyond what is needed for routine operations. Instead of producing drawings to accompany notes, the office produces references to internal custody. Instead of naming locations precisely, it relies on categories that make sense only to someone already inside the system. Instead of allowing attachments to travel into public repositories, it requires that supporting material remain in the custodial chain. The consequence is institutional. Once restricted becomes routine, silence stops being a gap and becomes a policy. A policy has inertia. New clerks inherit it. New managers adopt it. The building's administrative language begins to treat the absence of specifics as normal. So normal that the people maintaining the record do not perceive themselves as withholding anything. In their minds, the record is being handled properly because it is being handled consistently. That is how institutional secrecy survives, not by constant suppression, but by procedural normalization. This normalization is reinforced by how recurring work is described. Repairs and updates, inevitable in a large residential building, are recorded in ways that avoid generating new technical artifacts that might expose older decisions. A stairwell adjustment becomes safety, maintenance. A corridor modification becomes preservation. A ventilation reroute becomes system upkeep. These descriptions can be true in a functional sense while still serving a documentary purpose. They reduce the chance that later readers can map changes onto an original plan set that no longer exists. If the language does not point to a drawing, no one can demand the drawing. If the file does not acknowledge a layout, no one can compare it. The system also learns to protect itself through internal completeness. A building that cannot provide public plans can still provide internal continuity. Logs that show work was approved, paid, and completed. That continuity satisfies governance and liability management without satisfying historical reconstruction. It creates a record that is internally persuasive even if externally frustrating. This is a subtle but important distinction. Silence is rarely maintained by leaving nothing behind. It is maintained by leaving behind enough to close questions without opening new ones. As the 1890s progress, the term preservation takes on a particular institutional flavor. It becomes a way to frame the building not merely as property, but as an asset with heritage. Heritage language is powerful because it implies stewardship, and stewardship implies legitimacy. When a record says preservation, it suggests careful guardianship rather than concealment. It allows those managing the building to present controlled documentation as responsible management. That reframing has practical benefits. It reduces the likelihood of friction with tenants, insurers, and partners who prefer stability. It discourages needless curiosity. It tells everyone involved that the building is being handled properly, even if the public record remains thin. The most telling feature of normalization is how little effort it requires once established. There is no longer a need for intervention meetings like those implied in 1884. There is no longer a need to rewrite entire registers. The system operates by reflex. A request comes in, it is routed internally. A note is logged, it is categorized. An attachment is referenced, it is retained rather than released. A term that once might have been specific is replaced by a term that can survive scrutiny because it resists it. The building's documentary posture becomes self-sustaining. This is how the Dakota's silence becomes institutional rather than personal. It stops depending on individual will and starts depending on workflow. A workflow is harder to challenge than a person because it has no face. If you ask who decided to classify a file as restricted, the answer is not a name. It is procedure. If you ask why details are missing, the answer is not because we removed them. It is because they were never required for this register. If you ask where the supporting material went, the answer is retained. Each answer is administratively valid. Together, they produce the same outcome. The record cannot be reconstructed into a full, contestable narrative of original intent. The consequence reaches beyond history. It shapes power inside the building's ecosystem. When documentation is centralized and restricted, the people who control access control interpretation. Contractors become dependent on internal guidance rather than public drawings. Renovations become negotiations with custodians rather than straightforward comparisons to filed plans. Tenants and outsiders lose the ability to verify claims independently. Over time, that produces a quiet hierarchy. Those inside the custodial chain operate with certainty. Those outside operate with approximations. And yet the silence does not present itself as silence. It presents itself as stability. That is the institutional achievement of normalization. The Dakota remains prestigious. The address continues to signal elite continuity. Property value can rise without parallel public debate about irregular documentation because the debate lacks material. In real estate terms, the consequence is concrete. Fewer public points of attack means fewer public points of hesitation. In legacy terms, the consequence is equally concrete. The building's narrative is allowed to remain intact because the record is no longer structured to contradict it. The more routine the silence becomes, the more it shapes what later generations assume is normal. Historians and archivists come to expect gaps. Researchers learn to accept that certain materials were not preserved. The absence is folded into the building's identity as if it were an accident of time rather than a result of administrative design. That is the final stage of normalization, when a deliberate posture becomes indistinguishable from inevitability. If you want to understand how this happens, you look for the smallest repeated acts, not the largest dramatic ones. A clerk using maintenance instead of naming a corridor. A custodian stamping restricted without explanation. A reference to supporting material retained that appears so often it stops being notable. Each act is minor. The repetition is total. And repetition in an institution is a form of enforcement. The block ends with a single physical image that captures that routine perfectly. A thin internal file cover from the 1890s, stamped restricted in faded ink, with the subject line written in careful, non-specific language, preservation, service areas, and beneath it a routing note that does not deny access but accomplishes the same thing. Circulate internally only. The most durable outcome of the Dakota's managed record is not what happened in the 1880s. It is what continues to happen now. The official narrative survives intact into the 21st century, while the original architectural plan set remains absent from the public archive in any complete reconstructible form. The building has been modernized, maintained, protected, and legally recognized for generations. Yet the foundational documents that should anchor its early identity still do not sit where comparable records usually sit. The silence did not expire with the trustees. It outlived them by design. In the present, the Dakota is treated as a settled object in public culture, a landmarked icon, an address saturated with reputation. That is the surface story, and it remains stable precisely because it does not require the missing plans to function. Tenants come and go. Renovations occur under contemporary oversight. The facade and public-facing identity are preserved. The building's narrative is reinforced by repetition. A few known dates, a few known names, the same shorthand descriptions that have circulated for decades. The story can be told without confronting what the archive cannot supply. But when you approach the building through the mechanics of verification, through what a researcher, an archivist, or a careful legal mind would actually need, the gap reasserts itself. The original plans are still not produced from municipal custody. They are not yielded by routine archival searches. What exists publicly is fragmented. References without attachments, descriptions without sheet numbers, and later documentation that confirms the building's continuing life without explaining its earliest configuration with the precision one expects from a project completed in 1884 in New York City. The action that brings this into focus is comparative. To test whether the Dakota's archival condition is simply the normal decay of 19th-century paperwork, researchers compare it with other major New York buildings of the same era, projects that faced similar pressures, similar municipal systems, and similar time. In many cases, even when a full original set is not perfectly preserved, the record still provides enough connective structure to reconstruct intent. Consistent plan numbering, deposited amendments, identifiable approval, sequences, and photographic traces that correlate with filed drawings. The archive behaves like an archive. It allows reconstruction, even if imperfect. Against that baseline, the Dakota remains oddly resistant. Its public record is not merely incomplete, it is structurally hard to assemble into a coherent original. It does not fail in the way old records often fail, through random loss, water damage, or gaps caused by known institutional disruptions. It fails in a patterned way. Specifics flatten into categories, attachments referenced but absent, internal vocabulary bleeding into public description, and administrative closure achieved without technical substance. The comparative exercise does not solve the case. It performs something equally important for the present. It shows that the Dakota's archival profile is not simply typical for its age. This matters because the modern world is built on records. Landmarks are protected by documentation. Renovations are authorized through filings. Insurance and liability are calibrated through disclosed conditions. In most cases, modern oversight creates a dense layer of contemporary paperwork that can partially compensate for lost 19th-century material. Yet even as modern documentation accumulates, it does not restore what was withheld or never deposited. Original intent, original layout logic, original circulation design, the earliest configuration of service spaces and partitions that shaped how the building functioned at birth. Modern records describe what is updated. They do not necessarily describe what was originally built when the original blueprint is absent. The consequence is that the mystery remains intact, not because no one has looked, but because the archive cannot be forced to yield what it was never structured to yield. The Dakota can be maintained without its original plans in public custody, and that practical reality becomes a form of institutional amnesia. The building continues to operate, so the absence becomes tolerated. Over time, tolerance becomes normal. Normal becomes official. The question, "Where are the plans?" is treated as a curiosity rather than a problem, because the building's ongoing legitimacy does not depend on answering it. Yet the comparative lens keeps the question alive. If other buildings of the 1870-1890 period can still be traced through municipal filings with more coherence, if other projects still leave behind enough to reconstruct the evolution of their interiors, then the Dakota's continued opacity is not a neutral accident. It is a legacy effect of the same administrative choices we have been tracking: consolidation, reclassification, restricted circulation, and vocabulary designed to prevent audit. The present inherits the results of that system, even if no one today intends to maintain a secret. The structure of the archive itself does the work. The present also reveals how narrative outcompetes documentation. In the 21st century, the Dakota's public reputation is reinforced by cultural repetition more than by archival proof. People know the building through stories and symbols. The landmark status and the aura of exclusivity function like evidence for most audiences. That is not irrational. It is how iconic structures operate in public memory. But for investigators, that aura is precisely the condition that makes the missing plans consequential. When reputation becomes the primary source of certainty, the absence of original documentation stops being a gap in a file and becomes a gap in accountability. There is also a quieter modern consequence. The building's internal history becomes easier to mythologize because it is harder to verify. Without complete original plans in public custody, each partial fragment gains disproportionate weight. A single internal notation can be read as definitive. A single later renovation can be mistaken for original intent. An architectural photograph without context can be used to imply certainty it does not contain. The lack of a stable plan set creates interpretive drift, and drift is fertile ground for both innocent error and deliberate narrative shaping. The present, therefore, does not end the investigation. It sharpens it. The Dakota story persists because the record persists in the form it was trained to take, sufficient for operation, insufficient for reconstruction. The building's modernization does not dissolve the original silence. It layers over it. And layering is not restoration. It is camouflage of a different kind, not intentional in the present, but effective nonetheless. The comparative conclusion is not that the Dakota is unique in having gaps. It is that the pattern of its gaps aligns with earlier choices. Attachments referenced but absent, specificity replaced by category, and restricted custody becoming routine. That alignment is what keeps the case alive in the present. It suggests that the same logic that protected the address in the 1880s continues to protect it now, simply because the archive still carries the imprint of that logic. The block ends on an image that belongs to our era, but echoes the 19th century. A modern archival request log entry, neatly typed, noting original plans, no complete set on file, and beside it a familiar procedural phrase that feels almost unchanged from the old custodial language. Consult internal holdings if available, followed by the same old problem. Translated into modern form, no holdings produced. There is a temptation in the present to treat an incomplete archive as a quaint inconvenience, an old problem carried forward because time is careless and paper is fragile. But the Dakota's case resists that comfort, because modern record-keeping is not helpless. When something is truly needed, contemporary systems have ways of forcing clarity, disclosure requirements, preservation reviews, insurance underwriting, engineering surveys, renovation filings. The city and the market both know how to demand documentation. And yet, for this building, the foundational absence remains strangely survivable. That survivability is the point worth sitting with. A missing plan set should create pressure. It should force a substitution, either a reconstructed baseline produced by modern measurement or a formal acknowledgement that the original intent cannot be verified and must therefore be treated as unknown. Instead, the Dakota persists in an in-between state, recognized, protected, maintained, traded as cultural certainty, while the core technical artifact that would anchor its earliest configuration remains out of reach. The building's legitimacy doesn't depend on proving the beginning. It depends on managing the present without reopening it. A single modern action illustrates how the old logic still expresses itself through procedure. In 2019, a routine archival request for original architectural plans, complete set, is logged through a contemporary catalog interface. The request is not denied with drama. It is processed the way any professional inquiry is processed. The output is a familiar bureaucratic sentence: no complete set available in public custody. That is not a revelation, it is a confirmation. But confirmations matter when they persist across centuries. The action, requesting the record, produces the same consequence again: the inability to reconstruct the building's original intention with full confidence, because the authoritative baseline remains absent from the public side of institutional memory. What changes, then, is not the absence. It is what the absence forces everyone to do around it. Architects, engineers, preservation consultants, and administrators learn to work with known unknowns. They rely on partial drawings, later filings, and on-site realities that may reflect decades of incremental alteration. They make decisions based on what can be verified now, rather than what was verified then. This is how a missing record becomes operational. It turns the building into a series of present-tense problems rather than a continuous documentable story that may be manageable. It is not the same as clarity. The deeper consequence is institutional, not merely technical. When a building of this stature can remain prestigious while its foundational documentation remains incomplete, it teaches a quiet lesson about how power interacts with record-keeping. Not because anyone today is conspiring to erase anything, but because the structure of access still privileges internal custody. If the most useful materials, detailed interior documentation, original circulation logic, early correspondence, are held privately or were never deposited publicly, then the public record becomes a ceremonial archive rather than a complete one. Ceremony can preserve reputation. It cannot always preserve accountability. This also reshapes the way history is written. In most cases, missing documents create humility. Historians qualify claims, engineers mark uncertainties, preservationists note limitations. But iconic buildings generate pressure in the opposite direction. Their status invites certainty. People want a stable story. They want the beginning to feel as solid as the facade. When the archive can't supply that solidity, the story is often stabilized by repetition, by the handful of facts that can be confirmed, and by the aura that fills in the rest. The Dakota becomes known through cultural weight, even as the technical record remains partial. That is not deception. It is the natural drift of public memory. But it matters because drift hardens into assumption, and assumption eventually substitutes for proof. There is another cost that is less visible. Every time a major building lacks a complete public baseline, it forces modern work to be more conservative and more expensive. Unknowns require contingency. Contingency requires time, specialized surveys, and legal caution. In plain terms, the absence of original plans does not only affect historians. It affects how risk is priced. It affects how renovations are scoped. It affects how confidently professionals can say, this was intended, this was later, this is safe, this is compliant, this is historic, this is modern. The archive's silence becomes a hidden surcharge on certainty, and still, the silence remains intact, not because it cannot be broken, but because breaking it would require a shift in what the building's custodians and the institutions around them consider necessary. The Dakota can remain a landmark without proving its beginning in public. It can remain an elite symbol without inviting the kind of scrutiny that a full plan set would enable. The modern system adapts, and adaptation becomes normalization. The same administrative outcome achieved in the 1890s, controlled detail, limited external reconstruction, continues to function as a protective layer, even when no one calls it that. This is the present-day reflection the file encourages. The mystery persists not in spite of modernization, but alongside it. The building has been absorbed into modern bureaucracy, yet its origin remains partly outside modern verification. That combination is rare. It suggests that the Dakota's early documentary posture did not merely remove paper. It shaped an enduring relationship between the building and the public record, one where prestige and operation can continue without full transparency, and where the absence itself becomes a stable feature rather than an urgent problem. If you were handed an archive that worked but could never be made whole, would you treat that as history's accident, or as the most successful kind of decision? The extension ends on a contemporary image that feels almost too small to carry the weight it does. A digital catalog screen, the Dakota's entry open, a search for original plans, returning partial references and later material, and a clean line beneath it that closes the question without answering it. No complete set on file. In the end, the Dakota does not confront us with a single missing drawing. It confronts us with a structure of absence, built as deliberately as stone, maintained as quietly as wealth. What began in the 1880s as consolidation became, by the 1890s, a routine of restriction. A vocabulary of maintenance and preservation replaced a language of specifics. Files were stamped, routed, retained. Names thinned. Attachments referenced, but never produced. And the public archive, designed to be a civic memory, was left holding only what could be safely held. We have followed the trail as far as surviving records allow. A partial administrative ledger, dated 1883-1884, noting approved modifications without technical annexes. Meeting minutes in 1884 that shift custody inward under the guise of administrative consolidation. Construction registers between 1884 and 1886 that flatten precise locations into service areas, leaving sheet numbers blank where they should exist. Municipal discrepancies, conflicting dates, displaced signatures, suggesting later stabilization rather than contemporaneous clarity. And in the 1890s, the quiet institutional seal, restricted, repeated until silence became policy. None of this proves a single dramatic motive. It proves something more disciplined, that power can survive without declaring itself, simply by controlling what is legible. The Dakota's EV prestige endured because the record could not easily contradict it, and institutions, trustees' offices, municipal systems, archival procedures, did what institutions often do when faced with influential silence. They adapted. They accepted the incomplete file. They continued the workflow. They allowed the building to become an icon while its origin remained partly outside verification. This is the moral that lingers in the corridors between documents. History is not only what happened, it is what was permitted to be preserved. And when preservation becomes selective, the absence is not a failure of memory. It is a method of governance. A door does not need to be locked if the map is never filed. A passage does not need to be denied if the drawing that proves it is quietly withheld. In such systems, truth is not destroyed. It is simply made difficult enough that fewer people attempt to reach it. So the Dakota stands, still monumental, still admired, still spoken of with certainty, while the foundational plans remain out of reach in public custody. The modern record moves forward, layered and compliant, yet never fully anchored to the beginning. The mystery remains intact, not because no one has searched, but because the archive was shaped to survive the search. And that is why these halls matter. If you suspect a line was altered, if you believe a file was curated, if you see in these omissions the outline of a deliberate hand, leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps. Illuminate what history tried to bury. If this investigation resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you choose to subscribe, do it so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because beyond the public facade, there are always more rooms than the record admits. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.